When the Paris peace treaties were signed on February 10, 1947, the world finally seemed to be at peace, at last, after the 6 years of cruel bloodshed and murder. However, the peace will last only 17 years, and dark, grim days of conflict loomed in the distance that threatened to end the whole world. On October 16, 1962, the two greatest superpowers armed with nuclear missiles collided, and the world entered a new level of tension. It seemed as if the long-dreaded human extinction would come at last, as the Russian nuclear missiles stood ready to launch at any moment on the island of Cuba, within 100 miles from the United States. The world stood still, holding its breath, as the last days of Earth neared, desperately hoping someone would save them. Finally, after 13 horrific days, the two great leaders, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, compromised and brought the Cuban Missile Crisis to an end, just barely saving the world on the brink of extinction. Cuba, a country located in the Gulf of Mexico just below Florida, is an island country that is under communist rule. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba was caught under the two greatest superpowers at the time, the US and the Soviet Union, and the overheated tensions between the two nations during the Cold War escalated to a higher extent when the US tried to take over Cuba with an attack called the Bay of Pigs, which ultimately failed and led to the terrible 13 days in October. In April 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decides to develop Cuba into a nuclear base, and in mid-July, Soviet shipments of conventional weapons and intensified military equipment are sent to Cuba. The Soviet Union responded that the shipments sent to Cuba were defensive, designed mainly to shore up a rebellious ally, while marginally improving its own political position on the region. However, the director of CIA, Mick Cohen, believed that Khrushchev was trying to overcome the United States' strategic superiority and extort diplomatic concessions by establishing a nuclear outpost near the US. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis commences as the world faces the greatest conflict in history. Day 1, October 16th. President Kennedy, principal of foreign policy and national defense officials, discovered a wide range of nuclear missiles in construction in Cuba from the U-2 spy plane findings. Discussions began on how to respond to the challenge. Two principal courses are offered: an airstrike, an invasion, or a naval quarantine with the threat of further military action. To prevent the leak of such news, President Kennedy maintains his official schedule, occasionally meeting with advisors to discuss the status of events in Cuba and possible strategies to bring them down. Day 2, October 17th. American military units began moving to bases located in southeastern U.S. as images from another U-2 spy plane shows additional nuclear sites in Cuba, including 16 to 32 missiles, along with the escalation of missile constructions. Day 3, October 18th. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko visits President Kennedy at the White House, asserting that any aid provided by the Soviet Union to Cuba is purely defensive and is not an act of aggression to the United States. Kennedy, as a response, reads Gromyko to his public warning for severe consequences to follow if offensive and threatful weapons were to be placed in Cuba. Day 4, October 19th. While Kennedy leaves for Ohio and Illinois, his managers continue to negotiate a solution for the crisis. Day 5, October 20th. With President Kennedy's return and a 5-hour-long discussion between top advisors and President Kennedy, the U.S. decides to deploy a quarantine. Also, President Kennedy starts preparing a speech to inform the public that would be aired across the nation on October 22nd. Day 6, October 21st. President Kennedy meets with General Walter Sweeney, of the Tactical Air Command, who tells him that an airstrike may not completely eliminate the missiles and resolve the situation. Day 7, October 22nd. President Kennedy calls former presidents to brief them all about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy formally establishes the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, instructing it to meet once a day until the end of the crisis. Also, President Kennedy writes to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, questioning him why he should start nuclear war for no adequate reason. Kennedy's speech to the public airs at 7 p.m., revealing the evidence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and calling for their removal, and announces the deployment of a quarantine across the Cuban coast.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Day 8, October 23rd. Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Edward Martin, seeks a resolution of support from the Organization of American States. The ships of the Naval Quarantine Fleet move in formation around Cuba. Soviet submarines threaten the fleet by moving into the Caribbean area. Soviet cargo ships with military supplies come to an abrupt stop, but the oil tanker Buttress continues toward Cuba. After the Organization of American States approves a quarantine, President Kennedy asks Khrushchev to halt any Russian ships heading toward Cuba, worried that a U.S. fish would be forced to fire a Russian vessel. Day 9, October 24th. Chairman Khrushchev replies indignantly to President Kennedy's letter on October 24th. Khrushchev writes that the quarantine is an act of aggression, forcing the Soviet Union to follow demands from the US by threatening an arbitrariness. Day 10, October 25th. Aware that some missiles in Cuba are now operational, the President personally writes a letter to Premier Khrushchev, persuading him to put a halt to the missile constructions. Oil tankers are allowed past quarantine line, but Soviet freighters turn and head back to Europe. Although UN Secretary General U Thant calls for a cool-off, this is rejected by Kennedy because the missiles will still remain in Cuba. In the halls of the UN, more public debate between the US and the Soviet Union is held about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Day 11, October 26th. A Soviet charter freighter is passed through the quarantine line after being searched for illegal military supplies and approved to proceed towards Cuba. In a private letter, Fidel Castro encourages Nikita Khrushchev to initiate a nuclear strike against the US in case of an American invasion of Cuba. Later, a letter written from Khrushchev to Kennedy makes a similar offer. The removal of the missiles quid pro quo, removal of the quarantine, and a pledge that the US will leave Cubans alone. Day 12, October 27th. Another letter from Moscow arrives at the White House demanding more conditions, such as the removal of the obsolete missiles in Turkey. Meanwhile, over Cuba, an American U-2 plane is shot down, and pilot Major Rudolph Anderson is killed. After that, he sends his brother Robert F. Kennedy to the Soviet embassy to privately agree to the Soviet Union's request. Day 13, October 28th. The 13 tense, blood-chilling days of the Cuban Missile Crisis finally ends. Radio Moscow announces that the Soviet Union has approved a solution and uses Khrushchev's letter affirming that the missiles be moved in exchange for a non-invasion pledge from the US on Cuba. The war was pulled back just in time from the brink of extinction when President John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev thought beyond their country's benefits and decided to save the whole world. Though the result wasn't what the two countries initially desired, the two great leaders both knew if even a single drop of Russian or American blood was to be spilled, the nuclear war would become unavoidable, and the notion saved the blue planet from becoming crimson with blood.